The Soviet Union began with a vision, a dream of equality, a dream of prosperity, a dream of a workers' paradise. It was a bold promise, one that resonated deeply with the oppressed masses. The economy was to be run by the state, where everything was controlled, from the production of goods to the distribution of wealth. No more would the few at the top benefit from the labor of the many. This was the path to a new world, and at first it worked. The early years were marked by industrial growth. Massive factories sprang up in once empty fields. Steel mills churned out iron, cars, machinery. The infrastructure was built. Cities expanded. People found work, and wages grew. A central planning system, unlike any seen in the West, was put into action. No longer would private entrepreneurs run the show. The state would determine everything: what was made, how much was made, and how it would be distributed. The government was the economy, and the economy was the people's. This vision was presented as the superior alternative to capitalism, where a few controlled the wealth and the rest struggled. In the Soviet Union, everyone was supposed to share in the bounty. At least that was the idea. But the Soviet economy was not as flawless as it appeared on the surface. The cracks were there from the start, though they were cleverly hidden. From grain shortages to inefficient production quotas, the dream that promised equality and prosperity started to show signs of decay. The cracks were small at first, easy to ignore. But what happens when the dream begins to unravel? The Soviet Union was built on the promise of efficiency, an economy controlled and organized by the state. But beneath the surface of this grand vision, there were critical flaws. The central planning system, hailed as a marvel, turned out to be anything but efficient. The state's role in managing every aspect of the economy was not a triumph. It was an illusion. The problem began with unrealistic goals. The planners set production quotas that were often disconnected from reality. The numbers looked good on paper, but they ignored the complex nature of actual demand. Factories churned out products that no one needed, while essential goods, food, clothing, and medicine were in short supply. Resources were allocated without regard to the needs of the people. Every region, every factory, every worker was subject to a top-down system of decision-making, where the central planners dictated what to produce, how much to produce, and where to send it. But what happened when the people needed something else? When a community had a shortage of basic goods, the planners' quotas couldn't save them. The result? Chronic shortages, long lines for bread, empty store shelves, and the black market. The people, the very ones the system promised to serve, were forced to turn to underground networks to get what they needed. These black markets became the lifeblood of a struggling society. On the outside, the system projected the image of control, but on the inside it was a failing, inefficient machine. Was this just bad management? A failure of the system to account for reality? Or was it something deeper, a systemic flaw that could not be fixed by mere tweaks or reforms? The Soviet Union prided itself on offering full employment. It was one of the cornerstones of its economic promise. No one would be left without work. But this claim, so often paraded in speeches and propaganda, masked a much darker reality. Behind the banner of full employment lay a system that was not just inefficient, but wasteful. In truth, many of the workers filling these jobs weren't contributing to any real economic growth. The government had created a facade of a bustling workforce, but beneath that surface, the jobs were often hollow. People worked in state-run enterprises, not out of necessity or productivity, but because it was their duty to the state. Factories were filled with workers who performed minimal tasks. Some spent their days moving products that had no market. Others worked in roles that could have been easily automated or eliminated altogether. These positions were not designed to boost productivity. They were designed to keep the illusion of a thriving workforce alive. The state demanded that everyone have a role, but it didn't care whether that role served any real purpose. State-owned enterprises, sprawling and bloated, were the heart of this inefficiency. They had no competition, no need to innovate. Managers were rewarded for meeting quotas, not for improving efficiency or quality. As a result, productivity stagnated, and the economy ground to a halt. The workers, once proud to be part of a system that promised equality and employment, were now trapped in unproductive roles with no real incentive to perform. But what was really happening behind the curtain? Was the system so flawed that it couldn't see the reality of what was going on? Or was it simply that the truth didn't fit into the grand narrative the state was desperate to maintain? As the Soviet Union struggled to maintain its economy, a new force emerged, one that would siphon off precious resources and set the stage for disaster. The arms race with the United States escalated, and military spending began to consume the very lifeblood of the Soviet economy. What had once been a vision of a thriving, equitable society now became a struggle to outdo the West in a dangerous game of military one-upmanship. The Soviet Union poured vast amounts of its limited resources into its military-industrial complex. Weapons, tanks, missiles, these were the priorities. While the West spent on consumer goods, technology, and infrastructure, the USSR's resources were diverted into the construction of military might. The military was no longer just a defense force. It had become the centerpiece of Soviet life. Factories built rockets instead of refrigerators. Research facilities developed weapon systems instead of consumer electronics. But the result was predictable. As defense spending ballooned, essential sectors of the economy began to suffer. Consumer goods, basic items like food, clothing, and household products, became scarce. People, once promised the benefits of a prosperous society, now faced empty shelves in stores. Basic infrastructure, too, began to deteriorate. The railways and roads that had been so essential for Soviet growth fell into disrepair. The Soviet Union invested heavily in its defense, but at what cost? While the world watched as military parades and missile tests dominated Soviet headlines, the everyday needs of the people were left unmet. The economy, stretched thin by the demands of military production, began to suffocate. How did this shift in priorities toward militarization over societal needs contribute to the decay of the Soviet economy? What happens when a nation invests in weapons and war at the expense of its own people? The answer is a slow, painful collapse. As the Soviet Union's economic cracks deepened, an insidious force began to take hold: corruption. While the state was supposed to ensure fairness and prosperity, it became clear that those in power were more concerned with personal gain than the collective good. Economic resources, already scarce, were siphoned off by corrupt officials, misallocated to inefficient projects, and wasted in a web of bribery and favoritism. The grand promises of equality and shared wealth were betrayed by a system of privilege. Government officials and party members lined their pockets with the very resources meant to help the people. It was not just a few bad apples. Corruption ran deep, so deep, in fact, that it became part of the system itself. The bureaucratic machinery that was supposed to manage the economy was rotting from the inside. State-owned enterprises, which should have been the backbone of the economy, were instead a breeding ground for inefficiency. Without competition or oversight, many of these enterprises became bloated, poorly managed, and focused more on satisfying the needs of political elites than meeting the needs of the people. Factories churned out low-quality goods that no one wanted, and infrastructure projects, meant to modernize the country, were often half-finished or poorly executed. The lack of accountability was perhaps the most damaging element. In a system where those in power were untouchable, there was no incentive for improvement, no punishment for failure. The bureaucrats in charge of vital resources could mismanage or steal without consequence. And as the economy spiraled further into inefficiency, the people suffered the most. How did these failures, corruption, mismanagement, and a complete lack of accountability contribute to the eventual collapse of the Soviet system? Could the dream of a prosperous state-run society ever survive in such an environment? The Soviet Union was vast, filled with rich, fertile land. It had the potential to feed its people. But despite this natural abundance, Soviet agriculture was in crisis. The very foundation of the system, collective farming, was a failure. The dream of a thriving, state-run agricultural system turned out to be another illusion, one that could not sustain the needs of the population. Under the banner of collectivization, vast tracts of land were farmed not by independent farmers, but by collective farms controlled by the state. The plan was to centralize control, to harness the power of the people for the common good. But instead of efficiency, it bred inefficiency. The lack of individual incentive meant workers had little motivation to produce quality crops. While the state demanded quotas, it didn't provide the necessary tools, support, or expertise. At the same time, rural infrastructure collapsed. The Soviet government invested little in maintaining roads, irrigation, and storage facilities. The result? Crops rotted in the fields or couldn't reach the markets in time. Harvests were often poor, and the nation struggled to produce enough food to feed its citizens. Even with vast agricultural land, the USSR could not escape the looming shadow of food shortages. The situation became dire. Cities experienced famine-like conditions. People stood in long lines waiting for basic staples. The promised abundance of the Soviet system was nowhere to be found. Collective farming had failed, and with it, the people's trust in the state's ability to manage even the most fundamental aspects of life. Could a system built on collective farming, one that ignored the needs of the workers and lacked the necessary infrastructure, ever sustain the nation? The evidence points to one undeniable truth. The Soviet Union's agricultural crisis was a major contributor to its economic downfall. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union had become heavily reliant on one thing: oil. The vast oil reserves buried beneath its land were a vital source of income, and for a time they masked the economic failures of the system. The USSR sold its oil to the West, generating massive revenue that fueled the state, funded military expansion, and helped cover up the inefficiencies of the domestic economy. Oil was not just an energy source. It was the backbone of the Soviet economy. But the Soviet Union made a critical mistake. It failed to diversify. The economy, already burdened by inefficiency and corruption, became dangerously dependent on oil exports. The state had bet its future on a single commodity, and when the global oil market shifted, so did the USSR's fortune. In the early 1980s, the price of oil plummeted. The boom years of the 1970s, when the Soviet Union reaped the rewards of high oil prices, were over. Global oil prices dropped, and with them, Soviet revenue. The effects were immediate and devastating. The government, which had relied so heavily on oil exports, found itself facing a budget crisis. Military spending, social programs, and subsidies all depended on oil revenue. With the price of oil falling, the Soviet economy was starved for cash. The USSR's failure to diversify its economy left it vulnerable to external forces it could not control. The collapse of oil prices highlighted the fragility of the Soviet economic system, an economic house of cards, propped up by one commodity. When that commodity faltered, so did the entire structure. Could the USSR have survived without oil, or was it doomed from the start, relying too heavily on a volatile resource and neglecting the broader needs of its people? The evidence suggests that without oil, the Soviet Union had little chance of survival. As the Soviet economy faltered, so did its grip on the Eastern Bloc nations. The economic rot that had taken root in Moscow spread throughout its satellite states. For years, the USSR had maintained control over its neighbors through a combination of force, coercion, and economic support. But as the Soviet Union's own economic foundation began to crumble, it could no longer prop up its satellite states. One by one, the Eastern Bloc nations began to break away, seeking more economic freedom and political autonomy. In Poland, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, unrest had been simmering for years. But as the Soviet economy weakened, the ability to maintain control over these nations waned. People no longer feared the Soviet system. They were hungry for change. The push for reform grew stronger, and the Soviet Union, already struggling to keep its own economy afloat, had little power to intervene. The Berlin Wall, once a symbol of the iron grip the USSR held over Eastern Europe, was now a barrier on the brink of collapse. In 1989, as protests erupted across the Eastern Bloc, the world watched as the wall came down. The USSR's inability to maintain its empire was not just a political failure, it was a glaring testament to the economic weaknesses within its own borders. Without the resources to maintain control, the USSR's internal decay became evident for the world to see. The Soviet Union's inability to support its satellite states exposed the extent of its economic failures. As its empire disintegrated, the once mighty superpower could no longer even hold together its own sphere of influence. These events set the stage for the final blow, the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. In an attempt to save the Soviet Union from its deepening crisis, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced a series of reforms, perestroika and glasnost, that promised to revitalize the economy and open up the political system. These reforms, however, would not only fail to heal the wounds of the Soviet economy, but would expose the deep fractures within the system, hastening its ultimate collapse. Perestroika, or restructuring, was Gorbachev's ambitious plan to reform the Soviet economy. The idea was simple: introduce elements of market reforms, decentralize economic control, and allow some degree of private enterprise. But the reality was far more complex. The Soviet economy had been so heavily centralized for so long that any attempt at reform, even a modest one, only revealed the depth of the inefficiencies and corruption. State enterprises that had been bloated and inefficient for decades were suddenly thrown into a chaotic, unprepared market system. With no infrastructure to support real market competition, the result was economic stagnation, rising inflation, and scarcity. Gorbachev's economic reforms were more of a shock than a solution. Simultaneously, Gorbachev introduced glasnost, or openness, aimed at encouraging transparency in government and granting more freedom of speech. The intention was to foster political reform, reduce corruption, and allow citizens to voice their frustrations. But glasnost had unintended consequences. As the floodgates of political expression opened, so did a wave of criticism and dissent. The people's frustration with the government, which had been simmering for years, now erupted into open protest. Gorbachev's reforms, which were meant to stabilize the system, only exposed the depth of the Soviet Union's internal problems. Were Gorbachev's reforms too little, too late? Had the Soviet system become so entrenched in corruption and inefficiency that no amount of reform could save it? The answers seem clear. Gorbachev's efforts, though well-intentioned, merely accelerated the inevitable collapse. By 1991, the Soviet Union was a shell of its former self. The once mighty superpower, built on the ideals of socialism and a state-run economy, was unraveling at an unprecedented pace. The combination of internal economic decay, military overreach, and the loss of its satellite states set the stage for the final blow. In the end, the USSR could no longer maintain its empire or its economic model. Internally, the economic system was beyond repair. Years of mismanagement, corruption, and a lack of real reform had hollowed out the Soviet economy. The centrally planned system was inefficient, disconnected from reality, and incapable of responding to the needs of the people. The market-oriented changes introduced by Gorbachev only highlighted the depth of the failures. Perestroika and glasnost had not just failed to fix the system, they had exposed its flaws for all to see. The Soviet Union was no longer able to produce enough to meet the basic needs of its citizens. Externally, the USSR had overextended itself. The arms race with the United States, the military buildup, and its involvement in proxy wars drained resources that could have been used to strengthen the economy. The Soviet military-industrial complex consumed vast amounts of the nation's wealth, while the civilian economy stagnated. As the global order shifted, the USSR found itself unable to keep pace with the growing demands of both its own people and the changing world. Simultaneously, the withdrawal of support from Eastern Europe further exposed the USSR's vulnerabilities. Once the Soviet Union's sphere of influence began to crumble, it became clear that the empire was collapsing from the inside out. As nations within the Eastern Bloc sought independence, the USSR could no longer prop up the regimes that had once been loyal allies. The Berlin Wall had fallen, and with it, the illusion of Soviet control. The empire was slipping through the Soviet Union's fingers. The final catalyst came in August 1991, the coup attempt by hardline communists who wanted to preserve the Soviet Union at any cost. The coup failed, but it marked the point of no return. Gorbachev, once a symbol of reform, resigned in the face of overwhelming opposition. The Soviet Union was done. Could anything have prevented this collapse, or was it inevitable? The forces that led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union had been set in motion decades earlier. The systemic flaws, military overreach, and political instability were all part of a larger pattern, a pattern that ultimately led to the end of the Soviet state. The collapse of the Soviet Union may feel like a distant historical event, but its lessons are eerily relevant to the world we live in today. Over-centralization, corruption, and economic mismanagement were the key factors that led to the downfall of the USSR, and these same issues continue to plague economies across the globe. The Soviet collapse offers a stark warning: unchecked power, inefficiency, and a failure to adapt to changing circumstances can bring even the mightiest empires to their knees.